Hello, and welcome to the 2022 Virginia Festival of the Book, presenting a virtual school visit with Traci Chee. I'm Sarah Lawson, Associate Director of the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities. Thank you for joining us. A couple notes before I hand the program over to our speakers. This event has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the Closed Captions tab at the bottom of your window. Also, we greatly appreciate the support of our sponsors for this event, Dominion Energy and the Friends of Jefferson Madison Regional Library. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers. Traci Chee is a best-selling and award-winning author of books for young people, including 1,000 Steps into Night, a Japanese-influenced young adult fantasy, as well as the Prince Honor book, Walter Award honoree, and National Book Award finalist, We Are Not Free, and the instant New York Times bestseller, and Kirkus Prize finalist, The Reader. When she isn't writing, she enjoys hiking, egg painting, bonsai gardening, and hosting game nights for family and friends. She lives in California with her fast dog. Traci, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited for this.
Thanks. And our moderators today, joining us from Virginia Run Elementary School in Fairfax, Virginia, we welcome fourth grade teacher Dustin Lee and school librarian Erin Siwert. Thank you both. All right, Dustin, Erin, take it away.
So first off, thank you so much, Traci, for joining us. It's truly an honor to have you with us.
Thank you.
So the first question we have is, how would you describe yourself as a student growing up?
Oh man, I feel like I was kind of that quintessential nerdy, straight A kid. Like I remember being kind of in elementary school, one of those kids who was always the first to finish their lesson, in class. And like, in order to keep me and these two other kids who also finished their work really early occupied, our teacher would kind of let us do like these, I think they were supposed to be enrichment activities, but really we just got to like put together jigsaw puzzles in the back of the room or like play computer games in the back of the room. And it was so much fun. But I also feel like, I was thinking about this, I was also like this really self-motivated learner. Like I just loved learning. I loved like knowing new things and like acquiring new knowledge and skills. And that's still true today, which is one of the reasons that I love research so much. It's just, there's so much out there to learn. And I love that. And so I was really lucky growing up to have teachers who kind of fostered that in me. They would give me opportunities to learn other stuff and expand my horizons. So, when in that classroom, like we'd finish our work early and go do these jigsaw puzzles or play these computer games, that teacher, I had her for both third and fourth grade. It was a third and fourth grade split. She would always have this extra unit of study that was like not prop sanctioned, by the state. Like in third grade, our extra unit of study was fairy tales. And in fourth grade, our extra unit of study was dragons. And so having kind of that ongoing, like, we're going to learn about fairy tales, or we're going to learn about these different types of dragons, really kind of, I think, helped me catch that like sci-fi fantasy bug really early on. And so I remember like when we were doing that fourth grade unit on dragons, I went to the library where I picked up a book from the Dragon Riders of Pern series by Anne McCaffrey. And it was like in the adult section. I should not have been reading that at fourth grade, I think. But like that set me off, and like I just became ravenous for sci-fi and fantasy, and it really kind of inspired my imagination. And so I was really lucky in that respect. And then the other like thing that I think typifies my experience as a student was like, even though I was like, I very obedient in the classroom, very quiet, loved to get my work done, always did my homework. I was that kind of student, but also I realized that I had this kind of like creative and rebellious spirit all throughout my time in school. And so like, that's why having these like extra jigsaw puzzles or having these extra units was really helpful to me. But by the time I got to high school, it was much more regimented. And so we didn't have like, oh, you can go study your dragons now, in our history class. And so one of the outlets that I found was that I really liked punk rock in high school. That kind of fueled my creative and rebellious spirit. And so I remember being, I think, a senior in high school. And so this was like a year or so after 9/11, and we were kind of on the verge of invading Iraq. And so I remember learning about, I don't know how, I was thinking about the story, I don't remember how, I learned about something called National Student Walkout Day in protest of the war. And I didn't know, like, we didn't have social media to connect us at the time. I didn't have a cell phone or anything. And so I don't know how I found out, but I did. And so my friends and I decided to participate in National Student Walkout Day, and we spent our first period art class making these protest posters. And then, like, at our nutritional break, we marched around like the school and like showed, like, you know, no war, like, and then walked out, protested in front of like our city hall building for a couple periods, and then came back in time for my English final. And so, like, a little rebellious, but also I'm here to take my test, you know. And so that was kind of me as a student.
That's cool. I think we have some Virginia Run kids like that, specifically on this panel. Maybe not so much of the quiet part, but I think they can relate to some other aspects.
Definitely. Definitely. It's great to have you here, Traci. Thank you so much for being here with us. It's great to hear all of these things about you. And I was also wondering, probably your ravenous love of reading might be part of your answer, but what led you to becoming a writer?
Yeah, thank you for this question. You would think that, like, you know, checking out all of these books from the library and getting them from the used bookstore was what fueled me wanting to be a writer. In fact, it was video games. I mean, I had always loved, like, you know, since I was a kid, since I was, you know, third grade, fourth grade, loved reading, loved, like, you know, if there was a creative writing prompt for class, I loved doing that. But it wasn't until I was in sixth grade when my mom finally let my brother and I get a console, a video game console. It was the original PlayStation is what we got. This is like 1997. So one of the first games and like kind of the biggest, hottest games released for PlayStation was Final Fantasy VII. And for those of you who play video games, this Final Fantasy franchise is part of what's called a role-playing game genre. And the role-playing aspect is like, it's really, really story focused. So Final Fantasy VII is like about like this group of eco-terrorists, and like the planet is dying and there's this evil corporation, and you're really kind of deeply involved in kind of the inner workings of these characters and as they try to save the world. It was, playing it was such a revelation for me because I had never before in my life been that immersed in a story. It felt like my choices really mattered, even though, like, you know, the story's going to play out, but it felt like I was that character. Like I knew these people and was in control of their lives. And it was such a wonderful feeling. I was like, I want to do this. I think I could do this as my job. You know, me being in sixth, seventh grade. And I looked around, you know, because I am that kind of like self-motivated learner. I was like, okay, I want to be a video game designer. How do I do this? I know I'm 12, but I really want to get started. But at the time, you know, I didn't have access to coding classes, and I didn't have graphic design tools or animation tools. Kind of the only thing that I had at my fingertips was paper and pencil, you know, colored pencils for drawing and you know, pen and paper. And so I was like, you know what? My favorite thing about this is the story anyway. And all I need for that is what I've got in front of me. And so I'm going to start my video game design career right now. I'm going to, you know, write out this whole video game all by myself. Drawing the characters. I even wrote to the company that makes Final Fantasy, Square Enix, and I was like, dear Square Enix, I have a really great idea for a video game, and I think that you should make it. Here's my contact information. And like, I faxed it off, you know, I used my parents' fax machine. They did not write back. I'm sure they got a lot of those kinds of letters, but, you know, that's kind of what set me off on this. And during that process, I realized, oh no, this is just what I want to do. I just want to do the writing. And so I wrote all throughout the rest of middle school into high school. And so by the time I was graduating from high school, I knew that I wanted to go into writing. And I unfortunately don't play that many video games anymore. I don't have that much time, although they released Final Fantasy VII Remake last year for PlayStation 4, and I did play that. I was like, sorry, editor, I'm gonna be out for a month while I play this video game all the way through. Got a platinum trophy in it. I'm very proud.
That's a surprise. Thank you for that.
That was going to be my off-the-cuff side question, if you played the remake, because that is awesome. So that is my favorite video game, Final Fantasy VII. That's so cool. I love to hear that. But to get back on track, so in 4th grade, we just finished up a writing unit on historical fiction. What is preparation like when you're writing historical fiction, such as We Are Not Free, compared to other writing genres?
Yeah, boy. So as you might have guessed from these stories, I really love like magic, fantasy, science fiction, that kind of thing. It's what I grew up reading. It's what I love writing the most. My first book over here, The Reader and the Reader Trilogy, fantasy. My next one, fantasy. But in between, after The Reader, I was looking around thinking about like, okay, what do I want to write next? And this story for We Are Not Free, which is about the Japanese American incarceration camps in World War II. And it's loosely inspired by some of my own family's experiences in those camps. My grandparents were 13 and 16 when they were evicted from their homes in San Francisco and then sent to these temporary detention centers, and later these more permanent incarceration camps further inland. I had always, like, ever since I found out about kind of this part of my family history, I'd wanted to write about it. I didn't know how. I didn't know how I could possibly tackle something so personal and so big, right? The incarceration lasted for 3 to 4 years, depending on which camp you were in. And also so relevant to what's going on around us in this country today. And I was like, I don't know if I could do this. I don't know if I could do this. And then I pitched the idea to my literary agent, and she was like, that's the one you have to do. Do that one. That's the book of your heart. I know it's going to be great. And I was like, okay, I guess. And then I did it. And the process was really, really different. I am not normally in fantasy a research forward writer. I'm like that. I'm an idea forward writer, where I'm like, oh, what would be cool is if there was like for The Reader, a world where reading and writing didn't really exist except in magical form, or like for 1,000 Steps Into Night, like, oh, what if humans lived basically side by side with demons and spirits? I couldn't do that with the Japanese American incarceration. And so I spent quite a lot of time doing the research for that first. It started, besides the things that I had already encountered in my life, I started researching in earnest by interviewing my relatives who had been in the camps. And so my grandparents that I mentioned, they had already passed away by the time, so I wasn't able to interview them, but I did get to spend entire days with my great aunt or my great uncle or my step grandmother and just ask them about their lives. Like, what was it like before the camps? What was it like in the camps? What specific events do you remember? What was an average day like? If you wanted to kind of have people remember one thing about that experience, what would it be? And my mom and I went on this road trip throughout California to like interview our relatives. And it was such a special experience being able to learn about their lives, like before, during, and after the camps, and to share that with my mom was so, so cool. So it started there. And then I kind of expanded into what was more familiar to me. I read historical fiction because I'm a fiction person. And so I started reading Farewell to Manzanar, Journey to Topaz. These were written by people who were actually there in the camps. And I felt like if I wanted to do the research, I should listen to the people who were there. And that expanded into more nonfiction. So I read newspapers from the time, like the Topaz Times was the camp newspaper at Topaz, where my grandparents were incarcerated. I found this book called Citizen 13660 by Mine Okubo, who is an artist. She was also at Topaz, and her drawings of these places that my grandparents lived was really, really striking. I checked out a ton of photographs. There are so many photographs available online at the National Archives or at densho.org. Densho Encyclopedia is a really, really great resource. There's so much out there. And then I feel like, the other things that I drew from included, like, I went to the camps. So I had been to Topaz a decade earlier on a pilgrimage with my mom and my aunt and my great aunt. And so I was able to stand at these old cement foundations where my grandfather's barracks had used to be. And I was able to, like, look out across the desert at the original barbed wire fences, which are still there in Utah, and kind of feel how lonely it was and how foreign, it was a really striking experience to me. And so I went back to visit Topaz. I visited Manzanar in California, which has a really great museum and a really great they have really great online resources as well. I went to Tule Lake, which is where my step grandparents are incarcerated. And then I also had the amazing good fortune to have my great uncle's kind of self-published memoir that he wrote just for the family. So I could, reference that for ideas. And then also my grandfather and grandmother had kept most of their letters to each other from during the war. And so I have most of the ones from I think most of them. He wrote dozens and dozens and dozens, probably 50, 100 letters to my grandma during the war after he had been drafted into the army and she was still in camp. And so I basically got to watch them fall in love through letters, which was a really, really amazing experience. And so I did a lot of research, and then that had to be what guided the story, as opposed to kind of me guiding the story. I wanted it to be like the history would guide the story for me.
That's phenomenal. Thank you so much for sharing the process. It's a really deep process that is really invested. In fourth grade, we don't spend so much time with the research because time is limited. But certainly we read through other examples and develop our craft through there. So that's great to hear that there's some similarities in the writing process.
Yes, thank you so much. That's fascinating. For those who haven't read or finished reading We Are Not Free yet, could you please give a brief historical context of what's happening at the time of the book?
Yeah, thank you. So let's see where to start with this. I'll start with 1941, right? The war, World War II, is already going on in Europe. The United States has not joined in yet, but on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. And the day after, President Roosevelt declares war and says, we're getting into this war. This is kind of our moment. And because it was Japan attacking, American soil, immediately there was this huge surge in anti-Japanese racism. And I want to rewind just a little bit to say that it didn't come out of nowhere, right? This racism wasn't new. It had been brewing for decades. Anti-Japanese racism, particularly on the West Coast, where, Japanese laborers had come in and started a slew of very successful farms that white farmers felt threatened their livelihood. So there was this huge tension already ongoing. And on top of that, this was still during the Chinese exclusion era, where only certain classes of Chinese people, usually men, could enter this country. And that had been going on since the 1800s. And so we already have a bunch of anti-Asian racism going on in this country. Then an Asian country attacks us, and that kind of sharpens that hatred and that war hysteria to specifically target people of Japanese descent, particularly on the West Coast. And so immediately after Pearl Harbor, the United States government rounds up Japanese American community leaders all up and down the West Coast, sends them to prison camps, basically, and then kind of sets the wheels in motion for what was then called an eviction, but sorry, was called an evacuation. You know, as if, you know, there's this whole military area along the West Coast of the United States, California, Oregon, Washington, parts of, you know, Arizona, also Alaska. And, you know, Japanese people are not allowed here because they're a danger to our country. And so by February of the next year, so 2 or 3 months later, President Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, which says that there are military zones in this country from which any or all persons may be excluded. And it didn't specifically mention Japanese people of Japanese descent, but it was kind of understood by everyone, particularly within the Japanese American community, that this was going to target them. This was going to target them specifically. And so in February, March, April, May, that's when the mass eviction begins. They called it an evacuation as if to say like, oh, it's a natural disaster, but really they were evicting people from their homes, places that they had lived their entire lives or had lived for decades, and then sent to temporary detention centers all up and down the West Coast. A lot of these were hastily erected and quite inhumane. So my grandparents, who were living in San Francisco at the time, were sent to the Tanforan Temporary Detention Center, then called the Tanforan Assembly Center, which was a former racetrack. And so I was reading in my great uncle's memoir, they were sent to this place, allowed to only take 2 suitcases, 1 for each hand, or if you had a baby in one hand, 1 suitcase in the other, as was the case for my grandma, who had to carry her younger sister. So they got sent to this place and they were forced to live not in an apartment, but in a horse stall. So this stall, 1 stall meant for 1 horse, housed my entire family, which was 8 people, 2 parents, all their kids. The walls had been very hastily whitewashed, and so you could see like bits of straw and bugs and old nails. It smelled like manure. There was 1 light bulb. There was no heating. There was no privacy, because in these old horse stalls, the roof didn't extend to the ceiling, so you could like hear the snores and the whispers. They didn't have plumbing in the stalls, and so they'd have to go brush their teeth in the horse troughs. I mean, it was a really, really kind of horrible situation. So they were there for a few months, from kind of spring of 1942 to late summer, fall of 1942, at which point they were evicted again and moved even further inland out of these military zones, right? Because they weren't allowed to be there, to places like Utah, Arizona, Idaho, Wyoming, right? Colorado. Like they were all kind of tucked away into these really inhospitable places, known then as War Relocation Authority camps. Now I call them incarceration camps, which is what they were. And so for 3 years of my grandmother's life, she lived 13 to 16 in a barrack in the middle of the high desert with no running water in the barrack, right? She would have to go to like these latrines and eat in mess halls and live behind barbed wire in a kind of 1 square mile radius. And so, is that enough? I feel like I could go on and on and on about this history, but like that was kind of like the basic premise of the Japanese American incarceration. Most of the camps closed in 1945, although Tule Lake, I believe, was open until 1946. And then the incarceration camps in Canada were in operation much later. I want to say like 1948 or 49. So quite a long time after the war ended.
And you did a wonderful job demonstrating that in the book. So much of that you're talking about is in there. Thank you so much for that. It's important.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the places where the Japanese and Japanese Americans were evicted from. I had the good fortune of working with Emma Ito in the last year in a fellowship, and she provided a lot of good history as well, including that there were quite a few Japanese and Japanese Americans in Virginia, and how many of them were also incarcerated as well. Not all, but many of them were. So that's a lot of history that provide some background for the book. So thank you so much for sharing that. Freya, I do see your question. We'll probably have time for that. So we'll get to that one later, okay? Just want to point out that we do see it. So the book tells the story of the Japanese incarceration during World War II. You wrote it in a unique fashion. So the story is told through different people's point of view. What inspired you to write it in that format?
Yeah, thank you for this question. It again goes back to the research, because as I was interviewing relatives, reading letters, like reading newspapers, learning all about this time, I got very overwhelmed with the amount of information that was out there and the differing accounts that were out there as well, even within my own family. The experience of my grandparents who were teenagers, renting an apartment in San Francisco from working class families. Like my great grandparents were a gardener and a shipping clerk. That experience of being evicted from their apartments was really different from my step grandmother's experience. She was from a farming family in the Sacramento Valley. So about 2 hours inland from San Francisco, they owned their farm. And so the experience of losing this thing that they had owned, this land that they had worked, was really, really different from people who were, evicted from apartments that they rented. And those experiences were both different from my step grandfather's experiences. He was in LA with his family, and they were very, very poor. They didn't have enough to eat sometimes. They were in an itinerant farming family. And so his experience of going into the camps and getting 3 meals a day, three reliable meals a day was again really different. And so I was like, oh no, how can I possibly distill all of these like really interesting things that I want to talk about into, just one character's story? And I could not figure out how to do that until, I realized, I don't have to, I don't have to tell just one character's story. I can tell, 14 characters' stories instead. And once I realized that it could be this novel in stories, that really opened up the whole book for me. And kind of the way that I settled on 14, instead of like 4 or 6 or whatever, was that I tried to let the history guide me. And so I knew I would be writing this book for young people who may not have heard about the Japanese American incarceration. And so I was like, okay, if I'm writing this and it's kind of an introduction, what do people need to know about the Japanese American incarceration in order to understand it? And so that's how I settled on. Each chapter is going to be about a different aspect of the incarceration, which is why we have, first chapter with 14-year-old Minnow. That's our window into the West Coast. It's a couple months after, the attack on Pearl Harbor. That anti-Japanese hysteria and racism is really, really high. And so we get to see them before they even leave. We get to see what his life is like. And then the next one is, I wanted people to understand kind of what the mass eviction was like. And so that's why we have Shig's chapter, Minnow's older brother, telling us like what it's like to get these eviction notices and like watching your whole neighborhood like having to sell all their possessions so they can fit into 2 suitcases and then be shipped off on buses to who knows where. And then I wanted to talk about the temporary detention centers and the War Relocation Authority camps. And so I kind of selected these different aspects of history. And that's how I found like, okay, I need a character to talk about this one. And I want that character to be interesting. And I need a character to talk about this one. So that's kind of how I settled on 14 different characters, 14 main characters.
It really reminded me of the play Allegiance, where in there they talked about the different stances that people took, the ones who were incarcerated, the Japanese and Japanese Americans, how some wanted to say allegiant to America and some wanted to rebel. And you definitely touched on that in your book as well. I thought you were going to touch on Final Fantasy VII and how in there you play as Cloud, you play as Tifa, you play as Sid. I thought you were going to tie it to that, but I guess not. That's okay.
I have to shout out to Allegiance. I was able to see that live, and it was really, really incredible. Yeah.
Thank you. And thinking of characters, you really get to know the characters in We Are Not Free from the style of your writing. They have such unique personalities and experiences. Could you explain the process of developing the characters?
Yeah, so that was a big challenge. I'd written books with multiple, the Reader trilogy has multiple characters in it, but I had never done 14 and they'd never kind of had to hold their own in these almost self-contained chapters. And so I knew I wanted them to feel different. Dustin, like you mentioned, right? I wanted it to kind of feel like, oh, you're from this character's point of view now, and this one. And I wanted to kind of see this kind of kaleidoscopic nature of all of these different reactions to the incarceration, right? Because there could be no one reaction out of, more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were incarcerated during this time. There's no way we could distill that into just one. And so I wanted to get a sense of like, there were people who kind of just were resigned to their lot. There were people who were angry in a way that they kind of shoved it down and just kind of carried on. There were people who were angry in a way that they acted out. There were people who were wanted to prove themselves to this country. And so I really wanted to get a sense of like, there were a lot of different reactions because there were a lot of different people in here. And so I kind of used that structure of, we're going to talk about this aspect of the incarceration, and now this one, and now this one, to try and pick characters who would be really interesting to hear from kind of for those sections. And so I think kind of one of the most obvious examples is chapter 4, is our introduction to the incarceration camp at Topaz, Utah. It's the first few months there, the camp is very bleak. It's just kind of heading into winter. It's like October, November, December. Not all the stoves are installed yet. Not all of the insulation is installed yet. These kids, from San Francisco, I've never seen snow before. It's dusty. It's not a great situation. And it would have been easy to pick a character who is resentful of that, to pick a character who was like, oh, I don't want to be here. This place sucks. And instead of doing that, I decided to pick a character who was like, I see that this has problems, but it's nothing you can't solve with a good attitude and a little bit of glamour, right? And so I decided to craft this character of Betty, who's loosely inspired kind of by my grandmother, who was herself, I think, from her letters, but with my grandfather, like trying to treat her life as if it was glamorous, as if she could go to these dances and could have a normal American teenage life. And I thought that would be more interesting to see that contrast between, this character who's so optimistic and this setting where anyone else would be so pessimistic about it. And then, to contrast that with the very next chapter, which is from Frankie's point of view. And Frankie is that guy who walks into every situation like he's gonna throw a punch. He's that kind of angry. He's outwardly angry. And so to have kind of, characters who would turn the situation on its head, and then characters who would contrast with what came before, that was really one of my goals, and kind of having all of these 14 people seem a little different every time that you saw them.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
And we've got some questions from the audience that we can ask. Freya is wondering, how many books have you made? And I want to add on to that a little bit. So not just how many books have you made, but how many books have you started, but then also just haven't quite finished too?
Oh, okay. I love this. Yeah, so I have published 4 novels, the Reader trilogy, and then We're Not Free. My 5th one is coming out in 2 weeks on March 5th. That's 1,000 Steps in Tonight. So I'll have 5 published novels. I have many unfinished projects, many that just did not go anywhere. You know, I got 10 pages in and I was like, oh, I don't know where to go from here. I have many short stories under my belt. And also something I'd like to mention is that each of these novels goes through dozens of drafts of revision before it ever gets to even my editor's desk. So before it was published, the reader, I think, had 35 drafts. Like the one that you see in your hand is draft 35. That's how many times I had to kind of go back through and reimagine it and change this and change that. So I have 4 going on 5, but each one I feel like has this whole world of revisions within it.
We have a student asking that question about the changes that took place as you were writing. And Lauren also is wondering, how long did it take you to publish your book, We Are Not Free?
Oh, We Are Not Free. So let's see. I'll start with The Reader, which was my first published novel, because that one was a little bit different. I had never had a published novel before. I didn't have a literary agent. I was actually a teacher before this career, before becoming an author. I couldn't hack it. It's a really hard job. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to give myself a shot at being an author. It's something I've always wanted to do. I wrote the first draft. So draft 1, beginning to end, of The Reader, 18 months it took me to finish, kind of just getting all the way through it. And then like another, year of trying to revise it so that it wasn't like super, super, super long. And so, there was that, and then many, many, many rounds of revision. So I'd say I finished the first draft of The Reader in 2012, sold it in late 2014, published it in 2016. But this is also, a story idea that I had been thinking about since 2008. The very first kernel of that idea came when one of my friends was like, hey, you should write me a fantasy story. And I was like, okay. And so I started writing about like this girl and a magical book and a pirate ship. And so it had been cooking in my brain for a really, really long time. So The Reader took me probably 10 years to finish the whole trilogy, 2008 to 2018, which is when the last book, The Storyteller, published. We Are Not Free was different because I had already, I'd gotten 3 novels under my belt. I was under contract for something else. And so We Are Not Free happened on a much shorter timeline. I think I finished the first draft of that in 3 months. It was sort of like down from 18 to 3. And then it was just like churning through those revisions to get it published in 2020. So the timeline keeps getting shorter the longer that I do this.
I'm sure it didn't happen this way, but I can just imagine you sitting there at recess while the kids are playing and you're just working on your stories, cranking them out. So Kate is wondering, what is your most favorite book that you have written?
Oh no. It's like, don't make me choose. So I have kind of these five novels, and they're all special in their different ways. Like, I mean, the Reader itself is close to my heart because it's the first novel I ever finished. It's the first novel I ever published. It allowed me, that book is what set me on my current career. And then, the end of that trilogy, The Storyteller, it was the biggest project I had ever done. It felt like a huge accomplishment. It's like probably 900, 1,000 pages, the whole thing all together. We Are Not Free is loosely inspired by my own family stories. And so that is special to me in an entirely different way, where I feel like I got this really, really precious gift of my family entrusting me with what happened to them, entrusting me with their experiences, and I got to turn it into something to tell the world, and that, like, having that happen, and then also We Are Not Free got quite a lot of acclaim. It's got some of these shiny stickers on it that I've always wanted on a book. Yeah, there we go. And so to have it recognized in that way, you know, by educators, by readers, and to know that people are seeing this story, seeing this history, this thing that happened to my family, and are remembering it and thinking about it and talking about it is so special. And so they're all nice. Like, I like them all. I did not mention book 2 of the Reader trilogy, so maybe that one, I guess, is my least favorite. I feel bad saying that though.
So we got about 5 minutes. What other books are you working on that we could look forward to in the future?
Yeah, I shout out to 1,000 Steps in a Night, which is coming out next. I'm going back to fantasy. So it is a Japanese influenced folktale road trip about a very ordinary girl who's like out and about running errands for her father one day when she is cursed to become a demon. And she does not want to be a demon. She wants to just return to her ordinary life. And she goes on this journey across this Japanese influenced realm of Awara, accompanied by like this magpie spirit who is always trying to steal things. And she encounters many different kinds of creatures along the way. And she discovers that, oh, hey, it's not that bad being a monster, because I get to do a ton of stuff that I never got to do before, just as, you know, an ordinary girl in my old little village. And so she has to decide if she really wants to, you know, stay human or maybe embrace her monster powers.
That's great. Well, it's time for us to wrap things up. Thank you to Traci and to everyone who tuned in. Visit vabook.org to explore resources related to We Are Not Free and to learn more about Traci's 2 in-person events in March at the Virginia Festival of the Book.
Yes, come see me. Thank you all so much. This was really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.